My name is Shireen Malik Afzali, she, her pronouns. I'm the Chief Equity Officer for the County of San Mateo. Thank you for being here this evening to join us in advancing shared humanity in our county. The goals of our session are to, 1, hold a space that acknowledges the pain and increased discrimination people are facing, especially our Muslim, Jewish, Arab, and Israeli communities. We have heard, sadly, about discrimination, Islamophobia, antisemitism in schools, within work settings, and in public settings. Second, we want to hold a narrative of shared humanity, care, and kindness across difference. Sadly, we're seeing a lot of divisiveness and increase of polarization instead of our recognition of our shared humanity and the shared differences, shared emotions and experiences across difference. We are not discussing politics or policy this evening. We recognize that this webinar will not be perfect, nor can it acknowledge all the varying feelings and needs people are experiencing. It's one space to feel connected to a broad set of human experiences that many hold and many can feel alone in at times. We come to this webinar from a place of love, believing that there are more we share than don't in our human experiences. We understand that feelings run very deep. People have lost loved ones, felt discriminated against, felt anger, pain, and hopelessness. We ask that you enter this space with an open mind and an open heart. Speakers today have put themselves out there to demonstrate something we don't often see, a shared humanity, recognizing that across our differences, there are so many common experiences and emotions opposing the divisiveness that we can all fall into at times. Thank you to the wonderful speakers today. Now I'm going to introduce your facilitator, Pastor Marilyn Bussey of St. James AME Zion Church and co-chair of the Peninsula Solidarity Cohort of Interfaith Leaders. She holds a special light that I'm sure you will feel. I'm going to turn it over to Pastor Bussey to introduce herself more, as well as allow the speakers to introduce themselves.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Marlon Bussey, and I'm the pastor of St. James African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. I'm happy to be here tonight to facilitate this really important conversation. As an African-American woman, I think that I resonate with all of the things that are going on across the globe and just in our lives. And we just want to spend some time having a conversation and listening with our hearts to varying perspectives to gain a greater understanding. That's what tonight is about, just getting more information, getting more understanding as to how we can better support one another in the times in which we live. So thank you for inviting me to come. And I want to introduce our speakers tonight. Karen Stiller is with us tonight, and she will be speaking from the Jewish perspective. And Maha El Gennady is with us tonight, and she will be speaking from the Muslim perspective. And I feel like I'm sitting with two of my ancestral sisters. I am Christian, Karen is Jewish, and Maha is Muslim. We're all from the same root, and so that's exciting. I want to ask at this time if Karen, if you would just give a little background of yourself.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Karen Stiller. So I have been a speaker with Islamic Networks Group for many years as part of their Interfaith Speakers Bureau. I'm really proud of the work that we've done together. Professionally, I work for the Jewish Community Relations Council as Senior Director of Jewish Affairs. Also been very involved over the years. This is how I know you, Pastor, through the Peninsula Multi-Faith and other interfaith organizations. And I recently was appointed to serve as Human Relations Commissioner in the city of Fremont.
Maha.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and thank you, Shireen, for the invitation. Shireen has been working really hard to put a lot of events like this together post October 7th, and I would just really appreciate it very much. I'm the founder and executive director of the Islamic Networks Group, which has been around for 30 years. We are a peace-building organization that works through education, interreligious literacy, and interethnic engagement, not only here in the Bay Area, but across the country. We have about 50 to 60 speakers from different religious and ethnic backgrounds that we work with to do the same kind of work that you'll be seeing tonight from both me and Karen.
Thank you so much. And one of the things that I do, in addition to pastoring, is I do co-direct the Peninsula Solidarity Cohort, and that's a group of about 40 interfaith leaders who come together for issues of social justice, just being a voice to those who have no voice. So I'm excited to hear all that you have to share with us tonight and to see how we can work together. I'm going to start this evening by asking each of you 3 questions. You'll each have about 15 minutes to expound, and then we'll have a little time for questions and answers after that. So the first question is if each of you would define the term in the history of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia on Muslim and Jewish communities. Define the terms and the histories. And if you can discuss Muslim and Jewish identities and help us understand the meaning and the history of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism and how they manifest today. It's a huge question, but I know you all can handle it. So whichever one would like to go first, please do so.
I think I'll go ahead and go first, is the way that we planned it on this one. So let's go ahead and get started. Just give me one moment. Okay, great. So yeah, we're going to start with understanding Islamophobia, and usually this presentation, ranges between an hour to literally 4 hours, but we only have 15 minutes. So both Karen and I condensed it to just 15-minute presentations. So let's see how well we do on this. So next slide. We're going to begin by first defining the Muslim identity before I get into anti-Muslim bigotry. Next slide. Muslims represent about 1/4 of the world's population, and they live all over the world, as you can see there on the map and on the chart next to the map. There are about 50 Muslim majority countries in the world with sizable minority Muslim populations in places like China, Russia, Europe, and the Americas. And this really speaks to their ethnic, linguistic, and cultural diversity. Muslims are defined by their religious identity, which is the religion of Islam. Next slide. It surprises people to know that Islam is not only monotheistic, but it's also Abrahamic, as the pastor pointed out, which means Muslims worship the God of Abraham, which they have in common, of course, with Jews and Christians. And all of the Abrahamic religions originate in the Middle East and are united by common beliefs and practices. And in the case of Islam, Muslims also recognize the earlier prophets that come before the Prophet Muhammad. So that would include Jesus, Moses, Abraham, Noah, and all the prophets before that. Next slide. And like other Abrahamic traditions, Islam essentially is a way of life whose practices lead to the cultivation of excellent moral character to better oneself, to better the world around us. And some of the values that are promoted by Islam is what you see there on the screen. They include life, mercy, justice, and compassion. So that, in a nutshell, is sort of sums up Islam and who Muslims are. We're now going to turn our attention to Islamophobia and its roots in history. Next slide. Islamophobia is essentially a framework, an ideology, a belief system by which Islam and Muslims are portrayed in the United States and other Western nations. Islamophobia, that framework, results in anti-Muslim prejudice, which then leads to hate crimes and discriminatory policies. Even though these three issues, the narratives, the prejudice, and the hate incidences are very separate issues, people often refer to all or one of these issues when they use the term Islamophobia. At ING, we define Islamophobia as a framework. Next slide. And this framework has three dominant tropes or narratives about Islam which directly affect Muslims or anyone who's perceived to be Muslim. And the most common trope is that Islam is culturally incompatible with Western society. The second is that Islam is a religion of violence. And the third is that Islam is monolithic. The picture that you see there on the slide depicts one of the common ways Muslims are usually portrayed in the media as angry, violent people. And that's pretty typical. We're now going to go through each of these tropes and show you how it leads to discriminatory practices. Next slide. The most common frame or trope is that Islam is culturally incompatible with the West. It's viewed as not having values in common with Western society, is not capable of being affected by them, doesn't influence them, and that the culture itself is inferior to the West, backward, sexist. I mean, I'm sure that you're familiar with some of these stereotypes that exist about Muslims and Islam. And from that trope, from those narratives, we get the greatest fears of Muslims living among Americans in their neighborhoods. So you'll see Americans, for example, some Americans protesting the building of mosques in their neighborhoods. They'll be working to try to ban Sharia or Islamic law in courts, even though it never really had a role to play except in personal law. Americans also will, some Americans, of course, will also tend to be suspicious of Muslims running for office or those serving the community. And this also leads to not supporting religious accommodations in both the workplace and in schools due to this irrational fear or concerns that Muslims must have an agenda of making America Islamic since they can't be American, according to this narrative. The second most common narrative is that Islam is a religion of violence and aggression. Therefore, Muslims are misperceived by their practice or appearance, people that look like me, as a security threat. And from that lens, we get government policies like the Muslim ban, the Muslim watch list, which has millions of people on it that have never been charged with a crime, by the way. The surveillance of mosques, racial profiling in airports, and even calls for a Muslim registry, which, of course, the last American president did. And the third trope is that Islam is seen as a monolithic block where Islam is essentialized to a few attributes, and therefore Muslims are all assumed to be the same. So what happens in Saudi Arabia or Afghanistan, the thought is, well, that must be what all Muslims do or how they think. And this particular narrative, this particular trope leads to guilt by association or collective blame and punishment. Calls for Muslims, for example, to condemn terrorism, condemn, what happened in October 7th, to condemn what happened on 9/11 and other events like this, derives from this particular trope, this collective punishment. Like if it happened by someone who claims the religion of Islam, it implicates all Muslims. So the combination of all of these tropes have been used to justify discriminatory practices to the degree that today anti-Muslim hostility is seen as normal and natural. And when you look at polls of American sentiments towards Islam, it bears all of this out. Now, when I've asked people about the historical origins of Islamophobia, people will usually say, well, it began after 9/11, right? And in their mind, that sort of justifies anti-Muslim behavior. The fact is, next slide, Islamophobia is much older than that. It actually goes all the way back to the Crusades. We find images and stereotypes of Muslims as infidels, aggressive people that where they were promoted in such a manner as early as the Crusades in the 11th century. This view was reinforced again in the 1400s with the beginning of European colonialism, which continued until the 20th century. So this is quite recent. And during that period of time, during these 6 centuries, European colonizers justify their power over colonized people by defining Europeans themselves as smarter, more capable, and generally superior. And then they described occupied people in Africa, in Asia, who were mostly non-Christians as backwards, primitive, and in need of civilizing. These narratives then are carried forward to the United States by several means, where we again see these images of Muslims in the United States. How does it happen? Next slide. It happens through various American institutions that play a role, primarily in education, public education, by what we teach and not teach about a people. So textbooks and other resources often portray Muslims in a very negative, negative lens, and through the lens of extremism, ignoring the rich history and the long history of Muslim contributions to civilizations in the sciences and culture, or their contributions to the United States since the enslavement of Muslim Africans. In the media, coverage of Muslims and Arabs is generally negative, and evidence of this is provided by several studies. So one study, for example, looked at tens of thousands of articles mentioning Muslims or Islam, and they found that 80% were negative, even when it's not covering terrorism. Other studies show that news coverage of Muslims is more negative than of other minority groups. Another study showed that terror attacks by Muslims in the United States receive 3.5 times as much media coverage as attacks by non-Muslims. Hollywood, video games play a role in how Muslims are depicted. And then we also have campaigns, hateful campaigns by white Christian nationalists across the country that target the building of new mosques. And of course, we've already talked about government policies such as the Muslim ban. So the combination of all of this is where we get implicit bias. It's the adoption of stereotypes about an entire group of people. And many people internalize these attitudes, which also impacts their subconscious beliefs. And these subconscious beliefs will override your values, and this has been demonstrated by several studies. And that means that even if people believe that they're not biased, they're not racist, their subconscious beliefs will cause them to behave in biased or racist ways, especially in times of fear, stress, or war, which is what we're experiencing today. Next slide. So what's the impact of all of this? Next slide. Of course, anti-Muslim sentiment increased dramatically after 9/11, and it's risen even more dramatically in the last few years, in the last few months. So according to a 2019 YouGov poll, only 15% of Americans have a favorable view of Islam. Only 15%. 40% have an unfavorable view. Nearly 60%, 6 out of 10, that's 3 out of 5, are very concerned or fairly concerned about a possible rise of extremism in Islam. Another poll, again, that sort of shows us a pattern here, found that 41% of Americans believe that Islam encourages violence more than other faiths. 50% of Americans believe Islam is not part of mainstream American society. And I want you to think about how these sentiments relate to all the narratives, all the tropes that I discussed earlier, right? There's a direct correlation between the two. Discrimination. A recent poll by UC Berkeley found that over 2/3 of those surveyed reported that they've personally experienced anti-Muslim hate in their lifetimes. And another more recent poll by ISBU found that Muslims experience higher levels of religious discrimination than any other groups in institutional settings. So this would include at the airport, when applying for a job, when interacting with law enforcement, when receiving health care, and so forth. Next slide, bullying. Other surveys have found that 1 out of 2 Muslim families say that their child was bullied for their faith, more than double the level of families in the general public. And according to the same surveys, 20% of Muslim students experience bullying on a daily basis. Next slide, workplace discrimination. Muslims only make up 1 to 2% of the workforce, but they filed more than 20% of religious claims. And of course, many more complaints go unreported for fear of retaliation. And more recently, Muslims and Arabs are experiencing withdrawals of offers, isolation and firings. And this is all based on a listening session that we held with the EEOC not too long ago. College campuses, even before October 7th, an average of 40 Muslim college students said that they experienced harassment and discrimination. That rate, the frequency and the type of harassment has increased dramatically since October 7th. So it now includes verbal harassment of students being called terrorists, vandalism of property, stalking of students who are perceived to be Muslim, doxing by digital trucks, intimidation, aggravated assault, and so forth. And in the worst case, it's led to hate violence. So the impact, next slide, the impact of today's current events have increased both anti-Muslim and anti-Arab hate by 200%, as reported by Muslim and Arab civil rights organizations. In October of last year, for example, the country mourned the murder of Wadia al-Fayoumi. This is the young boy that you see pictured. He was a six-year-old Palestinian boy who was stabbed 26 times in his home in Plainfield, Illinois. Wadia's mom, Hanan Shaheen, was also stabbed a dozen times and choked. That she managed to call for help, but tragically it was too late for Wadia. Police authorities revealed that the suspect knocked on Shaheen's door, yelling, "You Muslims must die," before assaulting her and Wadia. In November of last year, 3 Muslim Palestinian students, you see pictured, were shot in Vermont while walking to visit a friend during Thanksgiving break. Thankfully, they survived, but one of them is now paralyzed from the chest down, and police said that they were walking and speaking in Arabic and also wearing the kafiyah Palestinian scarves that you see there in the picture. And then in early February, just this month, the young man that you see pictured lying in bed, his name is Zakaria Dor, was stabbed by someone riding a bike who pursues the vehicle that Zakaria was riding in. He yells racial slurs and then stabs Zakaria when Zakaria steps out of the vehicle to confront the man. And thankfully, Zakaria survived that attack. Now, of course, these violent hate crimes reveal the worst outcomes of prejudice attitudes, which is why it's important to address this issue and to try to prevent it as much as possible. Who else is impacted by Islamophobia? 3 main groups: Arabs, Palestinians, and Sikhs. And there are others that are mistaken for being Muslims. I think it's important to note here that 65% of Arab Americans are Christian, and yet they bear some of the burden of Islamophobia. Anti-Arab tropes compound Islamophobic tropes and vice versa, as do anti-Palestinian tropes. Now, Palestinians, of course, are an ethnic group. The tropes against them include not being recognized as a separate ethnic group from other Arabs, not being indigenous to the land that they're on today, or that their displacement in 1948 never happened. And these tropes compound Islamophobic tropes as Islamophobia compounds anti-Palestinian racism. And finally, Sikhs are also mistaken for Muslims and are victims of harassment, bullying, and racial profiling. Thank you. So I hope I did this topic some justice in the 15 minutes or however long I took. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Maha. If I could just break in very quickly to say that for those of you who may have joined late and you need interpretation, please go to the globe icon at the bottom, click on that, select the appropriate language of your choice, and you will be put into the channel with live interpretation. Thank you. Turning it back to you, Pastor Bessie.
Thank you, Maha, for that information. It was very, very valuable, and I just learned a lot that I did not know. I hope that our viewers learned a lot as well. It's so important for us to have information rather than misinformation. So thank you so much for sharing. We're going to turn it over now to Karen to give us the answers. And for those that are tuning in a little bit late, I've asked both speakers to define terms in history of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia on Muslim and Jewish communities, and to discuss Muslim and Jewish identities, helping us to understand the meaning and history of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism and how they manifest today. So with that, Karen will begin.
Great, thank you. So anti-Semitism, it's complex and it's been around for a long time. But one of the most important things to know is that Jews are targeted for who they are, not just for how they pray. And behind much of the anti-Semitism that we see today is a real lack of understanding about Jewish identity. And that's where we'll start. Next slide. So who are Jews? Jews are an ethno-religious group, which is a grouping of people unified by a common religious and ethnic background. Someone can be Jewish by descent or family background, or by converting to Judaism. Jews trace their lineage back to the Hebrew Bible's patriarch, Abraham. The English term Jew comes from the biblical Hebrew word Yehudi, meaning from the kingdom of Judah, which was located in ancient Israel. Over time, the term Jew changed to a term about ethnic origin rather than a people from a particular kingdom, and Jews maintain this connection across millennia. Judaism is the faith of the Jewish people. However, it's important to note that you don't have to be religious or believe in Judaism to be Jewish. In fact, you could be atheist or even practice another religion. So why is that? Next slide, please. Jewish identity does not fit well into a box. We're often seen as monolithic, white, and privileged, but we're actually racially, ethnically, socially, politically, and economically diverse. Approximately 15%, 12 to 15% of Jews in this country identify as people of color, and in the San Francisco Bay Area, approximately 25% of Jewish households contain a person of color. That number jumps up higher to, I think, around 40% for younger families. Jews connect to being Jewish culturally, ethnically, through family background, religiously, through Jewish values and ethics, in many other ways. In addition to European Jews called Ashkenazi, like myself, there are Black Jews, Asian Jews, Mizrahi Jews who are from the Middle East and North Africa, Sephardic Jews, Ethiopian Jews, Latinx Jews, LGBTQ Jews, and many more. Many Jews have intersectional identities and live in interfaith families. Jewish ethnic subgroups each have distinct cultures, traditions, ways of praying, dress, food, all reflecting the parts of the world that they currently live in. The map that you see, I know that it's tiny, but it shows different ethnic subgroups of Jews across the world. There are approximately 15.2 Jews in the world, which, by the way, is still below our pre-Holocaust numbers. Over half of the world's Jews live in Israel, where Mizrahi Jews, so Jews from the Middle East and North Africa, make up over half of the Jewish population. But despite all of this diversity, Jews across the world are united by a common sense of Jewish identity or peoplehood. Next slide. What is anti-Semitism? So simply put, and this is not a precise definition, but this is really just a starting point. So simply put, anti-Semitism is hatred, prejudice, or discrimination directed toward Jews as Jews. And historically and in modern times, societal ills have been blamed on Jews. What it looks like reflects the era of the time, yet it often contains the same myths, tropes, and conspiratorial theories about Jews. To be able to do something about it, we need to be able to recognize that. And sometimes, it's pretty easy. Like if somebody uses a slur against Jews or promotes open violence against Jews because they're Jewish. But sometimes it's not easy for a lot of people to spot it or understand it, especially when it involves political issues or when coded language is used. Today, anti-Semitism ranges from microaggressions to Holocaust jokes to swastikas and other anti-Semitic graffiti to anti-Semitic bullying to violent attacks against Jews at events, synagogues, and on the street. Next slide. Anti-Semitism is not a new phenomenon. It's called one of the world's oldest hates for a reason. There are three major forms of anti-Semitism that Jews have faced historically: religious, political, and racial. all three forms of this type of anti-Semitism are present today, and often anti-Semitism actually falls into one or more categories. Anti-Semitism involving political issues is often the trickiest to identify, as it's wrapped up either in political language or it uses dog whistles, which are coded language that people may use to confuse or hide what they actually mean. And what we're seeing right now in this moment is that Jews are being scapegoated for what's happening in Israel and Gaza. Many Jewish families also have what's called historical or multi-generational trauma. And the kinds of anti-Semitism we're seeing today is triggering fear from past family and collective experiences of marginalization, violence, and powerlessness. So, for example, recently in a protest at a local high school, a rogue group of students, so a group of students that weren't with the main group, knocked on classroom doors yelling, "Bring out the Jews." So not only did this scare the students, with some students calling their parents to pick them up, but it also scared the families. It compounded their fear due to memories of pogroms against Jewish communities across the world. Next slide. So the oldest form of anti-Semitism is religious anti-Semitism, in that Jews were denigrated for their religious beliefs. They were associated with the devil, charged with deicide, killing Jesus, and seen as a threat to those in power. It grew with the rise of Christianity and became institutionalized in the Middle Ages with restrictions and laws on Jews around where they could live, where they could work, and forcing them to wear identifying marks or clothing. A modern day example, this is a little bit of an obscure theory. It's a QAnon theory, which involves the blood libel. And I'll explain what the blood libel means in a minute. But in this adrenochrome conspiracy, there's a rumor that global elites, so global elites is a code word for Jews, torture children to harvest the chemical called adrenochrome from their blood, which they inject into themselves in order to stay young and healthy. Next slide. Political anti-Semitism focuses on Jewish conspiracies to dominate the world. And this started after Jewish liberation and assimilation that came following the French Revolution in Western Europe in the late 1700s. A modern example of this is this flyer you see on the bottom of the screen. So these have been distributed all across the Bay Area, California, and other parts of the country. This says every single aspect of X. So in this case, it says COVID agenda, but it could be the war in Ukraine, it could be pedophilia, it could be whatever issue somebody doesn't like. They blame it on the Jews. On the left, you see a picture of an old forgery called the Protocols of the Meetings of the Learned Elders of Zion. This was forged by the Russian Tsarist police a long time ago. Sadly, this book continues to be sold and used today. It alleges that there is a world Jewish conspiracy to take over the world by these learned elders of Zion. Next slide, please. Racial anti-Semitism was based on the pseudoscience of eugenics and social Darwinism. And in this, it stratified people based on, supposed physical characteristics. And it considered Jews as inherently inferior and a problematic race that must be dealt with. So this type of anti-Semitism is the type that led to the Holocaust, where 6 million Jews were murdered for being Jewish. A modern example of this is on your bottom of your screen, which is an Instagram page from a school in Marin County that was collecting the names of Jews in the district. So this was actually put up by a student. And this is how Nazis targeted Jews. They collected their names. And some of the students who were targeted had actually lost family members in the Holocaust. So this was, this multiplied the trauma of having this happen. And also the image you see, which is a really common anti-Semitic image, is a stereotypical drawing of a Jew with a big hook nose and beady eyes and looking. Next slide, please. So as you may have noticed in the previous slides, you saw I mentioned a couple of these myths and tropes. So these are really, really important ways to be able to spot anti-Semitism. If you can recognize these myths and tropes, and these have been used against Jews for centuries. So the first one is power and control. And this one says that Jews have outsized power and control over the societies that they live in, such as control of the media, banks, and government. Wealth and greed. This says that all Jews are wealthy, and part of how they get to be wealthy is by being greedy. And this stereotype about Jews and money actually came from the Middle Ages because money lending and tax collection were some of the very few professions that were actually open to Jews. There's the blood libel that I mentioned in the slide earlier. And in this myth and trope, it says that Jews use the blood of non-Jewish children in their religious rituals. And this is often expressed today as Jews being warmongers, bloodthirsty, rejoicing in the death of others, or somehow being inhumanely ruthless because they're Jewish. Dishonesty and disloyalty, this says that Jews can't be trusted, that they're more loyal to other Jews or to Israel than the country that they live in. Deicide, that Jews are responsible for killing Jesus. And then finally, Holocaust denial, which is a little bit newer of a myth and trope, which says the Holocaust didn't happen, or that it was exaggerated, or that somehow it was the fault of the Jews. And I want to note that we're actually increasingly hearing denial on other parts of Jewish history, such as Jewish connection to the land of Israel, or that Ashkenazi or European Jews aren't real Jews, or that anti-Semitism is exaggerated and Jews weren't actually marginalized minorities historically or in modern times. Next slide, please. So anti-Semitism has been on the rise for a while. The chart on the left, again, this is quite small, but it shows over the last several decades, rough numbers of anti-Semitism. And you see there's a red arrow there. That's approximately around 2016, and that's when it started to really dramatically rise. And last year, it was already at an all-time high. In the 2-month period between October 7th of 2023 and December 7th, the Anti-Defamation League, or ADL, documented 2,000 anti-Semitic incidents of assault, vandalism, and harassment across the United States. This was a 337% increase from the same period in 2022. 73% of Jewish college students have experienced some form of anti-Semitism since the beginning of the school year, and 44% in the same survey they took of non-Jewish students had experienced or saw anti-Semitic incidents. It's quite widespread on college campuses. A 2023 survey of Bay Area Jewish identity found that 36% of Jews had experienced or directly witnessed anti-Semitism in the 2 months following October 7th. This was a huge rise from when this question was asked in 2022. 63% of people in this same survey agreed that people make assumptions about them because they're Jewish. And this points to what Maha was talking about earlier, which is this unconscious bias or stereotypes that are quite widespread in society. ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, just released their 2024 survey of anti-Semitic attitudes in the US. And that found that 1/4 of Americans believe 6 or more anti-Jewish tropes. That's a rise, I think, from 20% last year. So that's 1/4 of Americans hold deeply anti-Semitic attitudes. We're seeing anti-Semitism more broadly and affecting more segments of our community than ever before. Next slide, please. So I'll give you a few examples. Right now, Jews are being threatened, attacked, and blamed for the actions of Israel. They're facing litmus tests and exclusion over their viewpoints, and they often feel silenced. A few examples. The Jewish student president at UC Santa Barbara has faced harassments and threats, including the signs that you see. So it's this The photo in the upper right hand, which was placed inside the Multicultural Center at the university, which is supposed to serve all students. Lake Merritt in Oakland has been repeatedly heavily vandalized with graffiti, some of which has supported and even called for violence against Jews. This week, Jewish college students were evacuated through underground passageways by police at UC Berkeley when a protest against an Israeli speaker turned violent. And this same week, it's been a tough week, at a city council meeting, a neo-Nazi called for the death of all Jewish Israelis using the anti-Jewish slur kike. And this was actually met with some applause in the audience. And at a middle school, a Jewish student was told that Jews deserved what they got on October 7th and that they should all be killed. And sadly, classic anti-Semitism is still happening. So we're still getting reports of things like throwing pennies at Jewish students, symbolizing these anti-Semitic attitudes about Jews and monies and Jews being cheap and greedy, to widespread Holocaust jokes, and where you have Jews being told you're too sensitive if you object. This is one of the most common things that we hear still today in our high schools. Next slide. So what's the impact been on Jews? Well, 61% in a recent survey of Jews in the Bay Area reported feeling less safe in their day-to-day life, and 22% feel much less safe. Visibly Jewish individuals are at a much higher risk for violent attack, and Jewish organizations and businesses have had to increase security as a result. Many Jews are feeling isolated, unsafe, and hiding their Jewish identity or any affiliation with Israel because of this. You'll see religiously observant Jews who wear a kippah or head covering, putting a baseball cap over it. Or you'll see Jewish students tucking their Jewish star, their chai, or some other symbol that they normally would proudly wear under their shirts because they're afraid of what they're going to face if they're identified. In Oakland, because of the anti-Semitism in general, feeling of kind of being unwelcome and fear for their children's physical and emotional safety, over 30 Jewish families have applied to transfer out of the district, and we're seeing similar things happening elsewhere. I just want to say, close by saying that like the greatest burden of all of this that's happening is being placed on children. Both Jewish and Muslim children are experiencing this. And, we as adults need to do a lot better. And this is one reason I feel so strongly about doing these presentations together. Across there.
Thank you so much, Karen. I hope that that we who are listening can hear the common themes between Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, and even the fact that the theme extends to what African Americans in this country experience on a daily basis. What I kept thinking is, wow, hate is a strong emotion. Fear is a strong emotion. Thank you so much for sharing what you've shared with us, giving us information, helping us to expand our knowledge base on these topics, because I think it's important for us to be able to speak intelligently about Islamophobia and anti-Semitism if we're going to help right the ship. At this time, we want you to both give us your thoughts on how to counter these forms of bigotry. How do we that want to be part of the solution help to counter the narratives that are out there? And both of you can, it's just really a conversation between the two of you now. So I'd like for you guys to discuss that and help us, let us listen in so that we can learn how to be allies.
Well, we actually prepared a PowerPoint. Being that we're in Silicon Valley. But yeah, we'll go through this together. So Karen, why don't you start us off?
Sure. So what we want to talk about is really how all of us might work together as allies to counter both forms of bigotry. Next slide. And we're going to offer 2 calls to action for community members. The first is to learn more about impacted groups. And the second is to work together to counter both forms of bigotry. So I'm turning it over to you, Maha, to start us off on the next slide.
Yeah. So in the next slide, here we're really talking about the population groups in the United States that are impacted by what's taking place in Gaza and Israel. But today we're only addressing Muslim Americans, the impact on Muslim Americans and Jewish Americans. Next slide. So as I mentioned in my presentation earlier, when I was talking about Muslims and also the pastor sort of affirmed the same, Abraham is foundational in all 3 faiths and is often referred to as the father of monotheism for his unwavering faith in God. And as the father of Ishmael and Isaac, he's also the progenitor of all the 3 traditions. The 3 Abrahamic religions share many common beliefs and practices, including the belief and the worship of the God of Abraham, the teachings reflected in the 10 Commandments, common prophets and their stories, the centrality of sacred scripture, and practices such as prayer and charity. So we have a lot of things in common that we can build on in the work that we do. Next slide. We also have many shared stories in the Torah and the Quran. Moses, for example, people don't know this, and even Muslims themselves may not know this, Moses is mentioned more than any other prophet in the Quran and is regarded as one of the most important and revered messengers. The story of Moses in the Quran is very similar to the narratives in the Bible, including the story of his adoption and upbringing in Pharaoh's household, followed by his struggles and eventual success in freeing the Israelites from bondage in Egypt. The Quran also concludes Moses' story with the revelation of the Torah. Because the Exodus story is one of the most often told story in the Quran, my organization has historically commemorated the story with Jewish friends in a program we called Halakha Seder, where we read the story together from our different perspectives and break bread during the Passover season. So on the slide there, you see an example of many the verses of both in the Torah and the Quran. They're very similar on the Exodus story. And I won't read these to you, but they're there on the on the slide. Next slide. There are also a number of shared practices among religions, including Islam and Judaism. So most religions have some version of prayer or worship, often at specific intervals or times of the day or week. Many religions also encourage their followers to engage in some sort of periodic fasting or giving up of a particular food for a period of time to develop spiritual discipline. So Muslims fast during the month of Ramadan, which, by the way, is about to start on March 11th. And of course, Jews have the fast of Yom Kippur and other fasts as well. Giving charity to those who are less fortunate is encouraged in both Islam and Judaism and really all religions. Finally, members of many major religions participate in pilgrimages or visits to sacred spaces and holy sites. Also, contrary to perception and probably unknown to many Americans is the fact that Muslim and Jewish Americans have always collaborated on shared interests and concerns for decades. And working together helps us build understanding and compassion for one another. We also learn more about each other in the process. And these are just a few examples that we pulled together that have taken place in recent history. So for example, my organization has held interreligious literacy panels, since 2007, and we do them with Hindus, Buddhists, and Christians and Jews. And we have a panel specifically for Muslim and Jewish Muslim and Jewish panels to counter our bigotry and to also address our shared interests and concerns. There's a great organization called the Sisterhood of Salam Shalom that's been around since 2010 that are involved in dialogue, in trips abroad and conferences. Jewish and Muslim families have joined forces in the advocacy of banning local government, San Francisco specifically, from preventing the shared practice of male circumcision. This happened in 2011. There's also a Muslim Jewish Advisory Council at the national level that works together on joint legislation and the promotion of religious freedom. It's also important to note that Jewish American attorneys supported Muslim immigrants after the Muslim ban in 2017. In 2017 and 2018, Muslims raised funds for Jewish American institutions after major hate crimes, raising 100,000 in one case and 200,000 in another case. And just very recently, major Jewish organizations in the country condemned Islamophobia. After the murder of Wadi al-Fayoumi, a statement was issued by our local JCRC that was signed by over 150 major Jewish organizations in the country. Another group of statements were also issued recently condemning the bigoted questioning of Muslim traditional nominee Adil Menji. So these are just a few examples. We have many more. My organization has done very similar work around condemning anti-Semitism, throughout the years that we've been doing the work that we do. I'll turn it back to you, Karen.
Sure, and I'll just say one of the first calls that we often get after there's been an incident of anti-Semitism is from MAHA and ING. So it's really a beautiful way to show solidarity with each other. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about working to prevent and respond to both forms of bigotry. And it's really critical before you go to do anything externally that you look internally. You have to understand yourself. You have to develop an awareness of your own thoughts, your own feelings. We all have bias. We all have bigotry. And it's really the only way you can do anything about it is to acknowledge it and start to work on it. Even if you don't believe you're biased, your subconscious, as Maha talked a little bit before about implicit bias, it may lead you to behave in biased ways. And it's really important to get that insight so that you can prevent those biases from happening. You need to make a commitment to overcoming your bias. Recognize when you're having a biased thought, reflect on where it came from and why it's unfair. Recalibrate. So take these negative assumptions that you may have and change them into positive ones. And do it habitually. So this is some, just some internal work that you can do before you're ready to work externally. And you need to hold yourself accountable. And when you fail, and don't give up. Like everybody, this is not perfect. And there are going to be stumbles along the way, but it's important that we try and we commit to this effort. Next slide, please. So what can you do in light of current events in our community? There's a few things. One is to show space and hold empathy for impacted communities. We need your support. You don't have to know what to say. You don't have to, be super, feel like you have to say the right things or even talk about what's going on. Just showing up and saying you care and how can I help you and do you want to talk, can we talk, is so critically important. Model civil discourse and create open, safe, brave, and inclusive environments in your own circles of influence. This is something that we're trying to do here today. We're trying to model civil discourse about issues where we may have differences of opinion, but we can still come together and see each other's shared humanity. And you have the most influence with your friends, with your circle of people that are, within your own political spheres or social spheres or, whatever. you have the most influence and can do the most good in there. Dialogue to learn and understand, which is really important. You need to go in with your ears, your eyes, and your heart open to actually listen to what somebody's saying instead of listening to think, okay, what is that person saying wrong and how am I going to counter it? Listen to learn. And then finally, be an upstander when you confront bigotry toward any group. If you see something, say something. Next slide. And that's it. Do you have anything to
You're
add?
on mute, Pastor Bussey. I'm sorry to jump in there.
No, that's okay. I hit the button, but it didn't go. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your insights, for your expertise, and most of all, for just sharing with us. I have one final question before we take some questions from the audience, and that is, what would you like the audience to walk away from this webinar knowing or feeling?
Like to go first, Maha?
Wow, there's a lot that I would want to. So I can go ahead and start and by saying that I just wrote a blog post about about what is happening in the country post October 7th, and the blog post is titled "Best Practices for Employers and Schools." And I think it's important for people to read it because what's happening in the country is really problematic, and it's something that we all need to address. So, for example, I write that, and this is just based on the dozens of, I think it's probably reached over 100 now, of calls that we've received from employers in every field imaginable from across the country, as well as college campuses, as well as schools. So that it comes from those conversations that we've had. People are feeling silenced or marginalized due to their political views or even humanitarian concerns relating to the current events. So, for example, if a person calls for a ceasefire to stop the violence against Palestinian civilians or supports Israel's fight, that in the former case, they're perceived as supporting Hamas, or in the latter case, they're perceived as supporting all of Israel's actions, right? People are being mischaracterized by their ethnic or religious identity as supporters of Hamas, if they're Arab or Muslims, or supporters of Israel's military actions against Palestinian civilians, if they're Jewish or Israeli. Some people are feeling triggered and very anxious watching on television and reading the news about civilian casualties. Some are feeling fearful and nervous about being charged with anti-Semitism or Islamophobia if they say anything that relates to the events in Gaza and Israel, even if their intentions are only to learn more about what's going on. So even employees who are not directly impacted by Gaza and Israel are spending energy and time avoiding certain people or having the conversation. Overall, people are feeling angry and upset by what they've defined as a hostile work or school campus environment due to either institutional actions or institutional inactions for perceived support of one side over the other for their actions or inactions in addressing any of the concerns that I just described. And when employees and students have reported problems, too often nothing happens and there are no changes at all, or they feel retaliation if they do report. It's always interesting to me when I sit down and talk with Karen about some of the things that Muslims and Arabs are experiencing. I am hearing from her the same exact things that are also happening to Jews, Israelis as well. And I think people need to be aware of that. This is not just affecting one group and not the other. And so, institutional leadership needs to provide guidance on how to have these conversations. I actually offer some suggestions in the article just based on best practices that I've seen. And I'm also really proud of all of the DEI and other executives that have called us in for training. Shireen is one of them, and I'm really proud of her for taking the initiative to do this work. in other cities in the Bay Area. Sunnyvale is one, and San Jose is another, that have said, listen, we admit that we might not have handled the outbreak of the current crisis well. We need to repair the damage or improve on what it is that we've already started. Can you come in and do training for us? Can you come in and help us sort of navigate this conversation, and why we're having this conversation? So I just think that, I would call for more training on both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. I prefer to do them together because it really forces people to listen to each other. Otherwise, the people that are, pro one group will only attend the Islamophobia workshop, and the people that are in favor of another group will only listen to the anti-Semitism workshop. And I think it's important, that we do this together, but just to do it period, and to include it in the DEI work that's that is happening. It's not happening everywhere, but we've gotten a lot of requests for it. Karen, do you want to add anything?
Yeah. Now, I'll just touch on that. You mentioned the DEI work, and this is one of the things that we've seen. Jewish identity, anti-Semitism, and I'm hearing from you, Muslim identity and Islamophobia are typically excluded, whether they're categorized, as, we don't address religious bias, or, for whatever reason. A lot of times these are just simply not included. And we're seeing the results of that. We're seeing the results that companies, schools, community organizations aren't sure how to handle these issues that are coming up, and they don't understand, how these bigotries work and how they're manifesting. And so it's just really critically important to include them when you look at doing any kind of inclusion work.
Thank you. I kind of wish we had another hour, because I'm sure we all have so many questions. We don't have another hour. However, I just have two final questions for you. Maha, you're both Arab and Muslim American. Karen, you're Jewish American, married to an Israeli. With communities in the country being so polarized right now, why do you want to do this work by coming together?
Sure. So I'll start. I think it's more important than ever that we do this work together. And it's not just now, it's not just post October 7th. We know every time a crisis has erupted in the Middle East, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia here at home have increased. And so when we sit together on a panel around Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, we're basically giving a signal to the broader community that not only are we interested in, of course, protecting our own communities, but we're also signaling that all forms of hate are wrong, and that we need to stand up for each other and humanize each other. And it's such a powerful experience with everything, speaking for myself, with everything that is happening and all the issues that we're dealing with, and just the heartbreak and the isolation and the fear. Doing these panels is really a bright spot, a bright spot in my day, in my week, particularly this week, which has been really tough. Maha?
So I think Karen hit the nail on the head, in her answer. And I just sort of want to emphasize that this is really the work that we've always done at ING. After 9/11, there was a huge demand to speak about Islam to audiences that weren't always friendly, and we did it. We didn't hide from the requests to inform Americans about who we are. We accepted every request that came in, as difficult as it was, and as dangerous as it was. I remember, going into places that, where I could have been harmed, I could have been shot. Huge events, and not knowing that, police wasn't checking who was armed and who wasn't. And I just feel like this moment is very similar to that. There's a huge demand right now to teach about Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. And both our communities are facing increasing threats of hate, harassment, discrimination, and violence, as I pointed out as both of us pointed out in our presentation. So it makes sense to be working together to combat bigotry. And as I said earlier, it honestly forces people to listen to me when I'm with Karen about Islamophobia, and it forces people to listen to Karen about anti-Semitism, right? And so that's why I think that I think there's value for for this primary reason, that it really forces people to kind of listen to both forms of bigotry that are real, that are happening, and that are impacting both our communities. We've done this since 2007. We've done over 400 of these over the years. We've done many more of them just in the last 4 months. Mhm.
Thank you so much. I have one last question for both of you, and we're running a little short on time. So if you could just answer very briefly. This is incredibly hard work. It is incredibly heartfelt work. How do you take care of yourselves and your staffs?
So I belong to a religious community, and my view is that this is all in God's hands. We're here to do our part in building peace in our communities, and we're doing all we can with limited resources. So for me, prayer throughout the day. I'm a practicing Muslim, so I pray at least 5 times a day. I fast during the week many times. I do a lot of what is called dhikr, or meditative walks. And I do daily recitations of litany, which is really what sustains me. Yeah, and I try to take as many days off as I can, and many breaks during the week, during the day as I can. Yeah, but it's been like Karen said, it's some weeks more than others. We're doing maybe 10 of workshops, in 1 week, and it can be really quite draining if we're not managing ourselves. Mhm.
I'll say getting together in community, so communal, just gathering really has been so critically important for the Jewish community. Knowing that we're not alone, that we can lean on each other. Taking mental health breaks, even if it's just for a few hours. I mean, I like to physically get away, go into nature, no cell phone reception for a couple hours. You can really kind of tune out, and that helps ground me. We've also where I work, we've been bringing in lunch once a week into our office. It's something simple, but it's like one less thing for employees to have to worry about as they're going through their day. And we've also been hosting periodic virtual healing circles for Jewish community members to really create a safe space for them to focus on sharing and gaining tools for anxiety, fear, and self-care.
That's fabulous. Thank you so much. I just want to say one last thing, and that is, I want to leave you with a quote from Martin Luther King. It says, "I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality. That is why right, temporarily defeated, is stronger than evil, triumphant." You all have given us unarmed truth, and you have exhibited unconditional love for each other, for humanity, and I just say thank you. I'm going to turn it now back into the hands of Shireen.
Well, I'm holding back some tears here as I feel the goosebumps. I am in deep gratitude for all 3 of you, for the wisdom that you have shared in this space, with the courage that you have stood in this space, in your truth. I really, really appreciate you sharing this with us. And I wish you health, healing, and love in this difficult period of time. And I say that to everyone because I want to lift up a few things that have been said by these brilliant people. We are building peace. All forms of hate are wrong. That we are all human. We have more in common than different. And that beautiful quote by Pastor Bussey, which I would invite her to write into the chat as well, is beautiful. I want to take a moment to ask that Andrew put an evaluation, very quick link into the chat. So if you might just literally takes 2 minutes, it's 3 or so questions. it will come to us. I also want to ask that there is a small army of people behind the scenes that have made this happen, and I would love all of you. There are 6 interpreters. Please put your videos on. We have 6 interpreters. We have Francis, Julie, Andrew. We have so many. Please show your video so we can all just really appreciate and see everyone who has come together to make this happen. I do not see Andrew, and Zach, I see Zach, so please come off video if you're comfortable. I really want to be in deep appreciation with this entire group who has brought their heart, their soul into this space to share in solidarity and love with all of you who participated with us today. We will make the recording available and place that, send it to all registrants. I want to say with love, goodbye, ma'a salama, and ja jigan. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
I would ask the speakers to stay on just for 5 minutes if possible for a brief debrief. Thank you to all the interpreters. Thank you to everyone behind the scenes. Thank you to all the participants who showed up with their hearts, spirits, and their minds open.